Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Harold Holzer, Director, Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Governor Andrew Cuomo.
Good morning. Thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the privilege of serving as director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, the one-time home of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and, before it became a part of Hunter, the birthplace of the New Deal. On behalf of Hunter College President Jennifer Rabb and all of us at Roosevelt House, which continues to train and inspire students in the Roosevelt tradition, it's my honor to welcome you here today for a special address by Governor Andrew Cuomo. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge some of the special guests with us today, among whom I begin with great affection and respect, the former First Lady of the state of New York, Mrs. Matilda Cuomo. A special acknowledgement, of course, to Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul, members of the governor's administration, labor leaders, community leaders, clergy, and advocates, with special thanks to the City Bar Association for hosting us. We hunted them, actually. And now to acknowledge a milestone. In 2 weeks, on New Year's Day, we will mark the 90th anniversary of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inauguration as the 44th governor of New York. We tend to focus exclusively on FDR's accomplishments as president, but beginning on January 1st, 1929, FDR launched a remarkable tenure as governor of the Empire State. And it was a time of enormous challenge. Roosevelt was holding the reins of state government for less than a year when the nation's economy collapsed in the wake of the Great Depression. While the federal government choked in paralysis, Governor Roosevelt pursued bold social and economic policies that not only led the state, but led the nation at a time when leadership was desperately needed and sorely lacking. It was during that time, as governor of New York, that FDR pioneered programs that would later morph into the building blocks of what became the New Deal: minimum wage, public works, and Social Security, which Governor Roosevelt conceived at Roosevelt House a few years later as president-elect, but he was still governor. The historian in me truly believes that the lessons from our past and the examples set by the great leaders of our past can light the way to a better future. At Roosevelt House, where FDR's four freedoms still adorn our walls and inspire our students every day, we're keenly aware of just how relevant Roosevelt's extraordinary life and experience can be in confronting today's challenging times. So we're incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to hear from Governor Cuomo as he answers the question that we posed: what would FDR do today? It's an appropriate question for him at this particular moment because, as I think everyone in this room knows, on January 1st, Andrew Cuomo will be sworn in for his third term as our governor after what can only be described as a historic landslide victory. I've been truly fortunate to know Governor Cuomo for more than 40 years, since I first served as an aide to his father, Governor Mario Cuomo. As a historian, it gives me great pride to have known two governors who will both go down in history for their strength of character and the litany of their accomplishments, Mario and Andrew Cuomo. I also know that Andrew, like his father, has always been a student of history, not only because he restored the neglected state capitol and its Hall of Governors and made both accessible again to students and the public, not only because he toured New York's greatest relic, the original Emancipation Proclamation, through communities around New York State for its 150th, not because of the exhibitions that he asks be mounted in the Capitol routinely, but also because history's great fighters for justice, especially Franklin Roosevelt, have always animated the governor's own perspectives and shaped his own views on government. In office, Governor Cuomo has applied those lessons and led, in the tradition of FDR and others before him, to produce middle-class prosperity, fiscal responsibility, to protect the labor movement, and to make New York once again the progressive capital of the country. Like FDR, he spearheaded groundbreaking state legislation that is setting an example for the entire nation to follow. And with the same energy and determination with which Governor Roosevelt once built Hunter College North and infrastructure across the state, and with which President Roosevelt went on to fund the WPA, which included the Triborough Bridge, the East River Drive, high schools, parks, and so many public works. By rebuilding roads, bridges, airports, train stations, and tunnels in the Roosevelt tradition, Governor Cuomo has moved to replicate the Roosevelt record in New York State and has done so with union labor. So as the nation's most accomplished governor, Andrew Cuomo's tenure is one FDR himself would approve of. A record that repeats what Roosevelt once called new and untried remedies to solve all the social and economic difficulties of the present. This morning, we look forward to hearing more about how New York will lead in the way that only New York can. In another moment of crisis, in the face once again of powerful adversity, in the spirit of FDR. As we remember the 44th governor, it is my great pleasure to introduce the 56th governor of New York State, Andrew Cuomo.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much. Well, it's an exciting day today, and first let's begin by thanking the New York City Bar Association for all the good work they do and for their courtesy today. Let's thank Brett Parker. Our great Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul, who does a magnificent job. I want to thank my administration that has been extraordinary. We did win a big election victory, but it was because we made the government work and we delivered for people, and that's a credit to them. And let's give them a round of applause. And it's a pleasure to be with my mother, First Lady Matilda Cuomo. I'll tell you something, but you can't tell anyone else. I'm my mother's favorite. I know because she told me. But she told me don't tell anyone else. So I won't. Some of my siblings get jealous. But we know it. We know it. Let's give her another round of applause because I'm her favorite son. And we have Harold Holzer. It's great to see a Queens boy who makes good. You know Harold Holzer as a renowned academic, as a Lincoln scholar. But as he mentioned, he worked for the state of New York when my father first became governor. He was an advisor. I was working in the governor's office. I was about 25 years old. 25 years old, you know all the answers. You just don't know all the questions yet. And Harold was old, relatively. You know, he had to be in his mid-30s. And when you're 25, mid-30s, you're an old guy. I think he was even married. One of those situations that happens later in life. So he had to deal with what I now call my constructive impatience. I didn't call it that then. But he was fantastic, and I want to thank him very much for the kind introduction and leaving out the not-so-kind parts. Harold Holzer, thank you very much. And my father loved Harold, and he would love today, Harold, because the topic is what would FDR do today? And it's appropriate, it's provocative, and it's timely. And it's something we should talk about. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the 44th governor of New York State. He was one of my favorite, second only to the greatest governor in the history of the state of New York, Mario Cuomo. But FDR was a strong, powerful personality. He was confident. He was action-oriented. He was a champion for the common men and women, as he liked to say. He felt the pulse of the people. When they were hurting, he demanded that the government respond to ease their pain, and he wanted it done today. His theory of, quote, bold, persistent experimentation highlighted his approach. Try to make a difference. If you fail at first, try again. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. FDR was not to be constrained by tradition. It ran counter to his natural confidence and his defiant personality, which refused to succumb to the naysayers, the elites, or personal or political paralysis. And FDR, New York, and the nation are the better for it. There are many lessons from FDR that we can and should apply today. His fundamental faith in democracy, his belief that big problems require big solutions, and his ability to make those changes happen, to make the government work, to actually make change. I recently won my third term as governor. As Harold mentioned, in fact, with the highest number of votes in history for a governor in a primary or a general election. There is a theory that the victory was due to my rapier wit and ravishing good looks, but then there is the mirror, and reality is undeniable. I believe the overwhelming vote was an indicator of the fear and the frustration existing among the body politic today. FDR's common men and women, as he would call them, are demanding change. They are outraged at the continuing economic injustice, the disproportionate growth and abuse of corporate power. They are afraid of Washington's arrogance, disrespect, and dysfunction. And they see their rights and their liberties being attacked as the federal government tries to impose its extreme conservative values on individual citizens. And they are uprising. And it is the same spirit of rebellion that forged this nation from the heavy hand of English tyranny under King George III. Most of all, Americans see the country's social fabric unraveling. And whatever your politics, that is frightening. FDR was called upon to govern in the midst of a great economic crisis that threatened the well-being of the nation. Well, today, my friends, we are called to govern at a time of great social crisis that also threatens the well-being of the nation. And today we see our greatest nightmare. We see our greatest threat, which is Americans in conflict with other Americans. We see this nation's greatest strength, its diversity, being perverted and distorted into its greatest weakness. The rise in white supremacist groups and the Ku Klux Klan and the rise in anti-Semitism and misogyny, this strikes at the core of who we are as a nation. Americans know instinctively that hate begets hate, and that Martin Luther King was right when he said we either live together as brothers and sisters or we perish as fools. Like FDR, we have to take the opportunity to take this crisis, harness the energy, and make it a positive force and not a negative one. And use this energy, use this moment, use this time to pass an agenda that can advance us all for years to come. Now, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, at this time of great need, FDR would know that there is no time to spare. And he would cast tradition aside to seize the day, carpe diem. Traditionally, in January, the governor of New York does a State of the State address. In the State of the State address, a number of topics are covered, but most importantly, laying out the legislative agenda for the following year as the governor sees it. This year, not only do we have disruptive times, not only do we have an anxious population, we also have a new political reality. We have a Democratic Assembly and a Democratic Senate, so we can actually get things done. So I want to be able to commence action immediately on the convening of the new legislature in the first week of January. Therefore, today I will outline my top legislative priorities for next year. We must begin by building on the positive. FDR was extraordinary at assessing the political and governmental landscape, and he would build on the strengths and he would reform weaknesses. Now, we've done a lot of good work over the past 8 years, and our state has made much progress, which we must continue and advance. We have pushed the state and nation forward with our progressive initiatives. We made New York State the progressive capital of the nation. We passed marriage equality, changing the national debate. We are the first state to truly attack economic injustice by raising the minimum wage to $15. And by passing the best paid family leave and free college tuition program in the United States of America. No state has done more to advance women's rights, labor's rights, LGBTQ rights, and freedom from discrimination, and we should be damn proud of it. We lead the nation on gun control and climate change. We lead the nation in construction and development, airports, roads, bridges, transportation, building an entirely new economic platform for the future. We created more jobs and economic opportunity in every part of the state, upstate, downstate, Long Island, and today we have more private sector jobs than we ever had in history, over 8 million. And part of our agenda is we must build on these successes, because these lessons were hard learned, but we now know that they are tried and true. New York State is on the right track, and we have to stay on the right track. FDR said, yes, we are on our way back. But not just by pure chance, my friends, not just by a turn of the wheel of the cycle, we are coming back more soundly than ever before because we are planning it that way. And don't let anybody tell you differently. And the same is true with the state of New York. We're coming back because we changed the direction, we changed our policies, we did the work, and that's why this state is at a better level than it's been before. But continuing our success is not enough this year, because next year's agenda must also address our new challenges. And while our ship of state is sailing well, the ocean upon which we sail is tempest-tossed. As FDR dealt with the historic economic crisis, we have to deal with an historic social crisis. We must protect New Yorkers from the reckless, unjust assault of our federal government. Perhaps for the first time in our history, we have a federal government that is taking us backwards and violating our civil liberties and national values. We have a president who simply doesn't believe in FDR's famous four freedoms and is affirmatively creating fear and want and stifling freedom of speech and worship. Affirmatively. FDR said, "Let us now and here highly resolve to resume the country's uninterrupted march along the path of real progress, of real justice." That was FDR's continuing theme, doing justice. And it's what my life in public service has been all about, and my father's, doing justice. And doing true justice, social justice, racial justice, and economic justice. And that's what our agenda should be for next year, a true justice agenda. We will start with economic justice. The federal government is once espousing their debunked theory of trickle-down economics, where the rich get richer and the poor get the crumbs from the table. They passed massive tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and corporations, paid for by the average Americans and average New Yorkers. Their tax reforms reduced deductions for state and local taxes, what we call SALT. So now this state, for the first time in history, since President Lincoln passed the income tax, we're going to be facing double taxation, where the federal government taxes our state and local taxes. That's how they're financing their tax cut for the rich, on the back of New Yorkers. New York follows a different model. We follow FDR, who said, "Here is my principle. Taxes shall be levied according to the ability to pay." That is the only American principle. Our state tax code is more progressive today than it has ever been. We must maintain our millionaires' tax, also make permanent our 2% cap on the regressive local property taxes, something that FDR fought against for decades. And we must do that because keeping property taxes down is more important now than ever because of SALT. Contrary to the current federal policy, we believe the people who need help are the hardworking families of New York. And we will fight SALT to the death, and I will once again propose cutting taxes for our hardworking middle-class families. Decent, affordable health care is also part of FDR's four freedoms: freedom from want and freedom from fear. The federal government has continued to roll back the Affordable Care Act, and we will make sure New Yorkers are protected. We must pass legislation protecting those with pre-existing conditions, codifying the health exchange, and ensuring continued access to prescription drug coverage, because New York believes health care is not a luxury. Health care is a basic human right. The president has appointed his hand-picked conservative extremists to the Supreme Court. The president's nominees don't even pretend to be objective jurists. They've already announced their intention to impose their morality on the nation and roll back Roe v. Wade, disrespecting a woman's fundamental right to make her own health choices and rolling back women's liberties, which have been in place for over 32 years. We have to stop this federal assault. We have to pass the Reproductive Health Act and the Contraceptive Care Act, and we must do it in the first 30 days of the new session. Thank you. With the federal government disrespecting women and attacking their rights, New York will ensure full equality under the law, no exceptions. The hard truth is that sexism is culturalized and it is institutionalized in our society. And it must end, and it must end now. And we've talked about it long enough and done too little. This year we must pass the equal rights law, needs to be passed in New York State this year. We must continue our national leadership on gun safety. History has proven us right. History has proven us right. As history proved us right in our leadership in opposing the death penalty those many years. God bless my father for his leadership. The SAFE Act was New York progressive government at its best. Since then, gun violence has only gotten worse. 2018 was by far the worst year for school shootings in American history. We must act. We must now pass the red flag law, ban bump stocks, and extend the waiting period for purchasing a gun from 3 days to 10 days, because New York must lead the way from this place of madness that this nation is in. The federal government has promised for decades to rebuild our nation's crumbling infrastructure. President Trump came to office, he promised a $1.5 trillion infrastructure plan, but we haven't seen any of it materialize. The only thing this federal government wants to build is a wall on the southern border as a monument to Trump's philosophy of division, which is the one thing we shouldn't be building with infrastructure funds. FDR understood that the social needs and the physical needs were interconnected, that the increase in employment by government stimulation of the private sector created good middle-class jobs and advanced the physical capacity of the state. It was a twofold success. FDR built the Lincoln Tunnel, created 14,000 jobs. In light of the federal inaction, New York has led the way. We have the largest state investment program in infrastructure in the country, over $100 billion. It's working all across the state, and going forward, we have to increase that investment from $100 to $150 billion, creating 500,000 new, good, middle-class labor jobs, and building a global economic platform for generations to come. Thank you. Thank you. This year, we have to take on the tough challenges that have been left aside literally for decades. and we have to begin by reforming our failing New York City subway system. The MTA was designed purposefully to diffuse political accountability, and it has. When everyone is in charge, no one is in charge. But that doesn't work if you want actual results. This year, we have to take the bull by the horns with the MTA. We have to pass a dedicated funding stream so the MTA has the funding it needs. Congestion pricing is the only alternative. But, my friends, we also have to reorganize the MTA. We have to change the culture. The numbers that they produce have to add up. We have to remove and reduce the levels and layer of inactivity and bureaucracy and end the benign neglect. No governor, no mayor, no county executive, no state legislator will fulfill their public obligation this year without addressing this critical need, period. We must bring justice to our education system, and not with hollow rhetoric, but with real reform. We must have an honest, factual discussion about the problem. FDR was very good at separating the politics from the heart of the policy discussion, and we have to do that with education. The fact is, this state spends more money per child than any state in the nation. But the fact is also the funding from the districts is not fairly distributed. Last year, for the first time, we demanded a full state accounting of how much each school in the state actually receives. About 6,000 schools. It had never been done before. And we demanded that accounting. We now have the results, and the results are disturbing. Because when you cast aside the political propaganda and you read the actual facts, the truth is that the poorer schools do not receive any more funding than the richer schools from their local districts. And that, my friend, is the critical injustice, because the poorer schools have a greater need that needs to be funded. Thank you. It's all a political game when we talk about education all too often. Too many distractions. The CFE lawsuit was resolved 12 years ago under George Pataki. The foundation aid program was stopped by Eliot Spitzer, who started it in the first place 10 years ago. These are ghosts of the past and distractions from the present. The question is the local distribution of aid. That's what we have to focus on if we're actually going to move from political pandering to progressive policy. It's a question of math and theory, not philosophy and political posturing. The state and local districts must provide more aid to needier schools, because every child, rich and poor, black and white, urban and rural, deserves the same quality education. While our federal government has declared war on our new immigrants, New York has a totally different vision. We believe we are all immigrants, and we believe new immigrants are an asset to our economy. We are challenging the federal actions on the southern border as illegal and unconstitutional. We believe it is un-American to rip babies from their mothers' arms. But now New York must practice what we preach. We must finally heed the wisdom of enlightened public officials like Senator Jose Peralta, God rest his soul, and pass the DREAM Act to open the door of education to all our dreamers. The federal government still denies climate change, remarkably turning a blind eye to their own government's scientific report. I've never seen anything like it, and we've seen a lot from this federal government. But they put out a report that says one thing, and then they publicly deny it. But denial is not a life strategy, and we will never solve a problem that we refuse to admit. Extreme weather is a reality. It is obvious across the globe. It is obvious to anyone with a television set. The consequences of our denial and delay are a matter of life and death, if not for us, then for our children. This is not an issue of present inconvenience. It is an issue of future viability. We know what we must do. Now we have to have the vision, the courage, and the competence to do it. New York must be the most progressive state in the nation, moving to renewables. There is real economic growth potential, and New York will launch the Green New Deal to make New York's electricity 100% carbon neutral by 2040, and ultimately eliminate the state's entire carbon footprint. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. There is a growing water crisis in our state and our nation, a degradation of our bays, rivers, lakes, streams, and especially our drinking water systems. Our industrial past has left the stain of pollution across the state. Industrial toxins have infiltrated many of our natural bodies of water, and drinking water systems, like the Grumman Plume on Long Island, like algal blooms in New York's upstate lakes, they are degrading rapidly and with a frightening speed and consequence. The federal EPA has become impotent, and not saying it nicely. They are slow to test chemicals, and they're slow to regulate chemicals. New York must stand up, take the lead to clean our water for our children and our children's children, do the science, regulate the chemicals, and leave this planet better than we found it, and we're going to do it this year. To continue our progressive path of justice for all, we must protect our democracy to make sure our government truly represents the people. We have to address the cynicism and skepticism that people feel. That is part of their outrage. And in the meantime, the federal government is working to disenfranchise voters. We have to do the exact opposite and improve our democracy. How do you do it? Automatic voter registration. Make it easier to vote and participate by voting by mail and by early voting. Synchronize the federal and state election days. Thank you. Thank you. And let's make a real statement about the importance of voting, and let's make Election Day a state holiday and say to people, get out and vote. We will also increase trust in the democratic system by closing the LLC loophole ban, banning outside income, reforming our campaign finance system, and take a major step by banning any corporate contributions to any political candidate, period. While our federal government is waging an all-out attack on the labor movement, which they are, and they're using the Supreme Court to do it, in both the public and the private sectors, we believe something different here in New York. We believe the labor movement is a force for social justice. We believe the labor movement is the force that built the middle class. We declare here and now that we will zealously defend and build the labor movement in New York, and that we're going to pass legislation to protect public employees in all local governments in the state of New York, period. This new economy, which is changing dramatically almost every day, the changes pose both opportunity and peril. Most changes normally do. The so-called gig economy is a growing economic engine. Freelancers, independent contractors, consultants are replacing traditional employees. And while many welcome the freedom and the flexibility of these arrangements, there are also pitfalls that go along with the positive. Gig jobs do not come with paid sick leave. They don't come with vacation days, or parental rights, or workers' compensation, or protection against work-related discrimination, or protections against wage and hour violations. We want an economy that moves forward. We want an economy of tomorrow, but we want an economy that moves everyone forward, not just some forward. The lack of affordable housing is a crisis across this state and across this nation, and it threatens one of FDR's core freedoms, freedom from want. Our federal government has abandoned its constitutional and moral responsibility. In the 1949 Housing Act, it said that this nation promised safe, clean, decent housing to every American. That was a national promise. And they have totally abrogated their responsibility. We will invest more in affordable housing than this state has ever invested in the history of the state of New York. And we will reform our rent regulations, including ending vacancy decontrol to protect affordable housing, and finally and truly respect tenants' rights. Now, a justice agenda means justice for all. The concept of justice and the great symbol of justice is that justice applies to everyone. There is no differentiation with privilege, wealth, or position. It doesn't put anyone above the law. For too long, the sexual abuse of children has been hidden and unpunished. And for too long, this state and this nation have had two forms of justice. One for average New Yorkers and one for people of position or people of privilege. That is going to stop. We must bring justice to those who have lived a life of scarring and abuse and suffering. And we must pass the Child Victims Act this year. New York State was the first large state to pass marriage equality, but unfortunately we have a federal government that still seeks to discriminate. So we must continue our leadership opposing the direction of the federal government. New York is the proud birthplace of the gay rights movement at the Stonewall. And we will pass a law that stops any discrimination against our LGBTQ community by passing gender this year. Thank you. Thank you. We will advance our justice agenda and particularly address the forms of injustice that for too long have unfairly targeted the African American and minority communities. FDR said, "No democracy can long survive which does not accept as fundamental to its very existence the recognition of the rights of its minorities." And the fact is, we have had two criminal justice systems, one for the wealthy and the well-off, and one for everyone else. And that's going to end. We must also end the needless and unjust criminal convictions and the debilitating criminal stigma, and let's legalize the adult use of recreational marijuana once and for all. And let's end the injustice in our criminal justice system. The first step is to replace the cash bail system. A judge should determine the individual's risk of release rather than the individual's access to wealth. And that's why we have to take the cash bail system and end it once and for all. Now, the agenda I have outlined is ambitious indeed. I understand that. I've worked in government a long time on many levels, and I understand how hard it is to make dramatic change in government. The lines on my face are proof of how hard it is. But I also know that few great achievements are ever done without pain. The great change does not come easily, my friends. Otherwise, it would have happened already. The ones that are left are the ones that are hard. And those are the ones that are our obligation to tackle. However, to answer the specific question of this forum, I believe this aggressive, progressive agenda, although hard, is what FDR would say these troubled times demand. Who he was, his ambition, would not allow him to do anything less than rise to the challenge of the times. FDR was not an incrementalist. He clashed with the timid, fearful politicians of his time. He ignored the naysayers, and he endured the choir of critics who would second-guess every change to the status quo. We talk about change, and people say they want change. But the truth is, the system as a system does not want change. It wants control, and it wants to retain the status quo. And that's why change is so hard. Now, this year we have a Democratic Senate, we have a Democratic Assembly, and that is going to help. But that does not mean there will not be adversity. State legislators have different constituents, And they have to represent and serve those constituents. New York City is different from Buffalo, and Long Island is different from the Southern Tier. And those legislators will have their own individual interest. And there will be vested interests that oppose change and repel the disruption. And there are vested interests that are very powerful in Albany that are going to seek to stop this. But our success lies in our ability to focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. Differences always exist. It's the ability to find the common ground that is the responsibility of true political leaders. That's what's going to make Albany different than Washington. And as a Democrat, it is our position to make change. We have a Democratic Senate, a Democratic Assembly. Now is the time to make these changes. There are no more excuses, my friends. Now is the time to stand up and lead and do what you've said you were going to do all those years and make a democratic vision a reality. And politics and government are not about talk. It's about action at the end of the day. And there is nothing progressive about a politician that fails to accomplish anything in the name of trying to accomplish everything. My father called himself a pragmatic progressive, a real-world, real-life progressive, a hard-working, middle-class guy from Queens progressive, aspiring to be the best we can be in the ideal, but accomplishing the most we can in the real. That was the brilliance of FDR and his Democratic Party, because FDR understood that you cannot spell progressive without progress. You can't be a politician who speaks and raises people's hopes and then accomplishes nothing. His national success was not born from pontification or zealotry or hyperbole or symbolism or celebrity or showmanship. FDR was focused on making a real, tangible difference in the lives of hardworking Americans. And he did it. And he did it. He accomplished it. He made it happen. And the American people knew it. Not because they heard it on a radio or because they saw it on TV, because they lived it in their lives. They saw it on their kitchen table. That's what government is supposed to do. Help me live my life. Make a difference for me and my family. That's what the Democratic Party was all about. So today, while Democrats bemoan our current federal government, let us remember FDR's example, that it is not enough for Democrats to criticize. We must construct. The negative argument is obvious. No one makes a better argument against Trump than Trump. There is nothing else you can say. Our burden is to prove the positive, to dispel the skepticism about activist government, and to show that the Democratic Party is more than words. And that skepticism that says all we do is promise, 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 but we never deliver. The Democratic leadership has to prove that it has the knowledge to govern, the skill to accomplish, and the understanding to unite. That yes, we are dreamers, but we are also doers. And yes, we can make a real difference in people's lives. Ladies and gentlemen, this nation is in crisis. The social fabric is fraying, and it is nearing its breaking point. We are under federal assault as individuals and as a state. We must stand up to this tyranny once again, not with muskets the way our founders did, but with our voices and our votes, and with the power and example of our action here in New York. As our forefathers rebelled against England, resenting the king's values and abuse, let us announce New York's rebellion from the current federal policies. My friends, let this agenda be New York's Declaration of Independence. We declare independence from this federal government's policies. We disconnect from the nationalism and the racism and the chaos and the xenophobia and the misogyny and the discrimination and the dissembling of this Washington administration. My friends, we proclaim our federal government's policy not only regressive, not only republic to New York values, we declare it un-American. We're going to pass this progressive agenda as New York's restoration of true democracy, restoring fairness, progress, and pride. And we're going to show what it means when people and government are guided by their better angels. And we're going to show what a nation can be when we are at our best. Let us show this nation what we can get done, the change we can make, the lives we can better. Let us remind people there's nothing that we can't accomplish when we work together. We are New Yorkers. We do it all. We do it better. We do it first. And let us be inspired by FDR's 1933 New Deal and do it in the first 100 days. Together we can, together we must, together we will, and FDR will look down and smile on all of us. Thank you, and God bless you.